Hello, third graders. It's time for Voyage of the Dawn Treader. We're on chapter 8. That's V-I-I-I. So when we left, Eustace, who had been turned into a dragon, and then Aslan turned him back into a boy again, but not the same Eustace he was before. This is a Eustace who was much more aware of being appreciative and recognizing what other people were doing to help him. I think Eustace has come out of this in a much better place, as hard as it was. And sometimes we go through hard things, but we come out the other end as stronger people and better people. And that's not a bad thing. And we certainly have Jesus to help us out, because that's huge. Okay, this is called Two Narrow Escapes. Everyone was cheerful as the Dawn Treaders sailed from Dragon Island. They had fair wind as soon as they were out of the bay, and came early next morning to unknown land, which some of them had seen when flying over the mountains, while Eustace was still a dragon. It was a low green island inhabited by nothing but rabbits and a few goats. But from the ruins of stone huts and from the blackened places where fires had been, they judged that it had been peopled not long before. There were also some bones and broken weapons. Pirates' work, said Caspian. Or the dragons, said Edmund. The only other thing they found there was a little skin boat or coracle in the sands. Okay, a coracle is just like a small boat. It was made of hide stretched over a wicker framework. It was a tiny boat, barely 4 feet long, and the paddle, which still lay in it, was in proportion. They thought that it either had been made for a child, or else the people of that country had been dwarfs. Reepicheep decided to keep it, as it was just the right size for him, so it was taken on board. They called the land Burnt Island and sailed away before noon. For some 5 days, they ran before a south-southeast wind, out of sight of all the lands and the seeing neither fish nor gull. They had a day that rained hard until the afternoon. Eustace lost 2 games of chess to Reepicheep and began to get rather like his old disagreeable self again. And Edmund said that he had wished that they could have gone to America with Susan. Then Lucy looked at them out the stern window and said, "Hello, I do believe it's stopping. And what's that?" They all tumbled up onto the deck at this and found that the rain had stopped, and that Drinian, who was on watch, was also staring hard at something astern, or rather at several things. They looked like little smooth round rocks, a whole line of them with intervals about 40 feet in between. "But they can't be rocks," Drinian was saying, "because they weren't there 5 minutes ago." "And one just disappeared," said Lucy. "There's another one coming up," said Edmund. "And nearer," said Eustace. "Hang it," said Caspian, "the whole thing is moving this way." "And moving a great deal quicker than we can sail, sire," said Drinian. It'll be up with us in just a minute." They all held their breaths, for it is not at all nice to be pursued by an unknown something either on land or sea. And what it turned out to be was far worse than anyone had suspected. Suddenly, only about the length of a cricket pitch, it's kind of like a football field, from the port side, an appalling head reared itself out of the sea. It was all greens and vermilions with purple blotches, except where shellfish clung to it, and shaped rather like a horse's, though without ears. It had enormous eyes made for staring through the dark depths of the ocean, and a gaping mouth filled with double rows of sharp fish-like teeth. It came up on what they first took to be a huge neck, but as more and more of it emerged, everyone knew that this was not its neck, but its body, and at last they were seeing what so many people had foolishly wanted to see: a great sea serpent. The folds of the gigantic tail could be seen far away, rising in intervals from the surface, and now its head was towering up higher than the mast. Every man rushed for his weapons, but there was nothing to be done. The monster was out of reach. "Shoot! Shoot!" cried the master bowman, and several obeyed, but the arrows glanced off the sea serpent's hide as if it were iron-plated. Then, for a dreadful minute, everyone was still, staring up at its eyes and mouth and wondering when it would pounce. But it didn't pounce. It shot its head forward across the ship on the level with the yard mast. Now its head was just beside the fighting top. Still it stretched and stretched till its head was over the starboard bulwark. Then down it began to come, not on the crowded deck, but into the water, so that the whole ship was under the arch of the serpent. And almost at once, the arch began to get smaller. Indeed, on the starboard, the sea serpent was now almost touching the Dawn Treader's side. So, like, here's the ship, and the sea serpent went up and over, and as it comes down, it's going to pull the ship down. Excuse me. Eustace, who'd been really trying very hard to behave well till the reins and the chest had put him back, now did the first brave thing that he had ever done. He was wearing a sword that Caspian had lent him. As soon as the serpent's body was near enough on the starboard side, he jumped up on the bulwark and began hacking at it with all his might. It's true that he accomplished nothing beyond breaking Caspian's second-best sword to bits, but it was a fine thing for a beginner to have done. Others would have joined him if at that moment Reepicheep had not called out, "Don't fight, push!" It was so unusual for the mouse to advise anyone not to fight that even in that terrible moment, all eyes turned to him. And when he jumped up on the bulwark, forward of the snake, and set his furry little back against the huge, scaly, slimy back, and began pushing as hard as he could, quite a number of people saw what he meant to do, and rushed both sides of the ship to do the same. And when, a moment later, the sea serpent's head appeared again, this time on the port side, and this time with its back to them, then everyone understood. The brute had made a loop of itself around the Dawn Treader and was beginning to draw the loop tight. When it got quite tight, snap, there would be floating matchwood where the ship had been, and it could pick out of the water one by one all the people. Their only chance was to, was to push the loop backwards till it slid over the stern, or else, to put the same thing another way, to push the ship forward out of the loop. Reepicheep alone had, of course, no more chance of doing this than lifting up a cathedral, but he had nearly killed himself with trying before the others shoved him aside. Very soon the whole ship's company, except Lucy and the mouse, which was fainting, was in two long lines against the bulwark, each man's chest to the back of the man in front, so that the weight of the whole line was in the last man, pushing for their lives. For a few sickening seconds, which seemed like hours, nothing appeared to happen. Joints cracked, sweat dropped, breath came in grunts and gasps. Then they felt the ship was moving. They saw that the snake loop was further from the mast than it had been. They also saw that it was smaller. And now the real danger was at hand. Could they get it over the poop deck, or was it already too tight? Yes, it would just fit. It was resting on the rails. A dozen or more sprang up to the poop deck. This was far better. The sea serpent's body was so low now that they could make a line across the deck and push side by side. Hope rose high till everyone remembered the high carved stern, the dragon's tail of the Dawn Treader. It would be quite impossible to get the brute over that. "An axe!" cried Caspian hoarsely. "And still, shove!" Lucy, who knew where everything was, heard him where she was standing on the main deck and staring up at the poop deck. In a few seconds she had been below, got the axe, and was rushing up the ladder to the deck. But just as she reached the top, there came a great crashing noise, like a tree coming down, and the ship rocked and darted forward. For at that very moment, whether because the sea serpent was being pushed so hard or because it foolishly decided to draw the noose tight, the whole of the carved stern broke off, and the ship was free. The others were too exhausted to see what Lucy saw. There, a few yards behind them, the loop of the sea serpent's body got rapidly smaller and disappeared into a splash. Lucy always said, but of course she was very excited at the moment, it may have only been her imagination, that she saw a look of idiotic satisfaction on the creature's face. What is certain is that it was a very stupid animal, for instead of pursuing the ship, it turned its head around and began nosing all along its own body, as if it expected to find the wreckage of the Dawn Treader there. But the Dawn Treader was already well away, running before a fresh breeze, and the men lay and sat, panting and groaning all about the deck, till presently they were able to talk about it, and then to laugh about it. And when some rum had been served out, they even raised a cheer, and everyone praised the valor of Eustace, even though it hadn't done any good, and of Reepicheep. After this, they sailed for 3 days more and saw nothing but sea and sky. On the 4th day, the wind changed to the north and the seas began to rise. By the afternoon, it had nearly become a gale. But at the same time, they sighted land on their port bow. By your leave, sire, said Drinian. We will try to get under the lee of the country by rowing and lie in the harbor, maybe till this is over. Caspian agreed, but a long row against a gale did not bring them to land before evening. By the last night of that day, they steered into a natural harbor and anchored, but no one went ashore that night. In the morning, they found themselves in a green bay of rugged, lonely-looking country, which sloped up a rocky summit. From the windy north, beyond the summit clouds, came streaming rapidly. They lowered the boat and loaded her with any of the water casks which were now empty. Which stream shall we water at, Drinian? Said Caspian, as he took the seat in the stern sheets of the boat. There seemed to be two coming down into the bay. Makes little odds, sire, said Drinian, but I think the shorter pull is to the one on the starboard, the eastern one. Here comes the rain, said Lucy. I should think it does, said Edmund, for it had already begun pelting hard. I say, let's go to the other stream. There are trees there, and we'll be able to have some shelter. Yes, let's, said Eustace. No point in getting wetter than we need. But all the time Drinian was steadily steering to the starboard, like tiresome people in cars who continue at 40 miles an hour while you're explaining to them that they're on the wrong road. They're right, Drinian, said Caspian. Why don't you bring her head around for the western stream? As your majesty pleases, said Drinian a little shortly. He had had an anxious day with the weather yesterday, and he didn't like advice from landsmen. But he altered course, and turned out afterwards that it's a good thing that he did. By the time they had finished watering, the rain was over, and Caspian, with Eustace and the Pevensies, that's Lucy and Edmund, and Reepicheep decided to walk up to the top of the hill to see what could be seen. It was a stiffish climb through coarse grass and heather. They saw neither man nor beast except seagulls. When they reached the top, they saw that it was a very small island, not more than 20 acres. From the height, the sea looked larger and more desolate than it did from the deck, or even from the fighting top of the Dawn Treader. Crazy, you know, said Eustace to Lucy in a low voice, looking at the eastern horizon. Sailing on and on into that with no idea of what we might be getting to. He only said it out of habit, not really as nastily as he could have done at one time. It was too cold to stay long on the ridge, for the wind still blew fresh from the north. Don't let's go back from the same way, said Lucy as they turned. Let's go a bit and come down on the other stream, the one that Drinian wanted to go to. Everyone agreed to this, and about after 15 minutes, they were at the source of the second river. It was a more interesting place than they had expected, a deep little mountain lake surrounded by cliffs, except for a narrow channel on the seaward side which the water flowed. Here at last they were out of the wind, and all sat down in the heather above the cliff for a rest. All sat down but one. It was Edmund, who jumped up again very quickly. They go in for sharp stones on this island, he said, groping about in the heather. Where is that wretched thing? Oh, now I've got it. Hello. It wasn't a stone at all. It's a sword hilt. No, by Jove, it's the whole sword. What the rust is left of it, it must have lain here for ages. Narnian, too, by the looks of it, said Caspian. They all crowded around it. I'm sitting on something too, said Lucy, something hard. Turned out to be the remains of a male shirt. By this time, everyone was on his hands and knees, feeling in the thick heather in every direction. Their search revealed, one by one, a helmet, a dagger, a few coins, not Calorman crescents, but genuine Narnian lions, and trees that you might see on any day in a marketplace in Beaver's Dam or Baruna. Looks as if this might be what's left of one of our 7 lords, said Edmund. That's what I was thinking, said Caspian. I wonder which it was. There's nothing on the dagger to show, and I wonder how he died. And how we are to avenge him, said Reepicheep. Edmund, the only one of the party who had read several detective stories, had meanwhile been thinking. Look here, he said, there's something very fishy about all this. He can't have been killed in a fight. Why not, said Caspian. No bones, said Edmund. An enemy might take the armor and leave the body, but who ever heard of a chap who's won a fight without carrying away the body and leaving the armor? Perhaps he was killed by a wild animal, Lucy suggested. It would be a clever animal, said Edmund, that could take off a man's mail shirt. Perhaps a dragon, said Caspian. Nothing doing, said Eustace. A dragon couldn't do it. I ought to know. Well, let's get away from this place anyway, said Lucy. She had not felt like sitting down again since Edmund had raised the question of bones. If you like, said Caspian, getting up. I don't think any of this stuff is worth taking anyway. They came down and round the little opening where the stream came out of the lake, and looking at the deep water within the circle of cliffs. If it had been a hot day, no doubt someone would have been tempted to bathe, and everyone would have had a drink. Indeed, even as it was, Eustace was on the very point of stooping down and scooping up some water in his hands when Reepicheep and Lucy both at the same moment cried, "Look!" So he forgot about his drink and looked into the water. The bottom of the pool was made of large grayish-blue stones, and the water was perfectly clear. And on the bottom lay a life-sized figure of a man, apparently made of gold. It lay face down with its arms stretched over its head. Just as it happened that they were looking at it, the clouds parted and the sun shone down. The golden shape was lit from end to end. Lucy thought it was the most beautiful statue she had ever seen. "Well," whistled Caspian, "that's well worth coming to see. I wonder if we can get it out." "We can dive for it, sire," said Reepicheep. "No good at all," said Edmund. "At least if it's really gold, solid gold, it'll be far too heavy to bring up. And that pool is 12 or 15 feet deep if it's an inch. Half a moment, though. It's a good thing I brought a hunting spear with me. Let's see what the depth is like. Hold on to my hand, Caspian, while I lean out over the water a bit." Caspian took his hand, and Edmund, leaning forward, began to lower his spear into the water. Before it was halfway in, Lucy said, "I don't believe the statue's gold at all. It's only the light. Your spear looks just the same color." "What's wrong?" asked several voices at once, for Edmund had suddenly let go of his spear. "I couldn't hold it," gasped Edmund. "It seemed so heavy." "And there it is on the bottom now," said Caspian, "and Lucy is right. It looks just the same color as the statue." But Edmund, who appeared to have some trouble with his boots, at least he was bending down and looking at them, straightened himself at once and shouted in a sharp voice, which people hardly ever disobey, "Get back from the water, all of you, at once." They all did and stared at him. "Look," said Edmund, "look at the toes of my boots." "They look a bit yellow," began Eustace. "They're gold, solid gold," interrupted Edmund. "Look at them, feel them. The leather is pulled away from it already, and they're as heavy as lead." "Oh, by Aslan," said Caspian, "you don't mean to say—" "Yes, I do," said Edmund. "The water turns things into gold. It turned the spear into gold. That's why it got so heavy. And it was just lapping against my feet. It's a good thing I wasn't barefoot. And it turned the toe caps into gold. And that poor fellow on the bottom, well, you see?" "So it isn't a statue at all," said Lucy in a low voice. "No, the whole thing is plain now. He was here on a hot day. He undressed on the cliff where we were sitting. The clothes have rotted away, or had been taken by the birds to line nests with, but the armor is still there. Then he dived in and—" "Oh, don't," said Lucy. "What a horrible thing." "What a narrow shave we've had," said Edmund. "Narrow indeed," said Reepicheep. "Anyone's finger, anyone's foot, anyone's whisker, anyone's tail might have slipped into the water at any moment." "All the same," said Caspian, "we may as well test it." He stooped down and reached up a spray of heather, and very cautiously he knelt beside the stream and dipped it in. It was heather that he dipped, but he drew out a perfect model of heather made of purest gold, heavy and soft as lead. "The king who owned this island," said Caspian slowly, his face flushed as he spoke, "would soon be the richest of all the kings in the world. I claim this land forever as a Narnian possession. It shall be called Goldwater Island, and I shall bind all of you to secrecy. No one must know of this, not even Drinian, on pain of death. Do you hear?" "Who are you talking to?" said Edmund. "I'm no subject of yours. If anything, it's the other way around. I'm one of the 4 ancient sovereigns of Narnia, and you're under allegiance of the High King, my brother." "So it's come to that, King Edmund, has it?" said Caspian, laying his hand on his sword hilt. "Oh, stop it, both of you," said Lucy. "That's the worst of doing anything with you boys. You're all swaggering, bullying idiots. Oh!" Her voice died away into a gasp. Everyone else saw what she had seen. Across the gray hillside above them, gray, for the heather was not yet in bloom, without noise and without looking at them, shining as if he were a bright sunlight, though the sun had in fact gone in, passed the slow pace of the hugest lion the human eyes have ever seen. In describing the scene, Lucy said afterwards, He was the size of an elephant, though at another time she only said the size of a cart horse, but it was not the size that mattered. Nobody dared to ask what it was. They knew it was Aslan, and nobody ever saw how or where he went. They looked at one another like people waking from a sleep. What were we talking about? Said Caspian. I had been making rather a fool of myself. They were arguing about the gold. They were being greedy, right? And the sight of Aslan kind of brought them around. Sire, said Reepicheep, this place has a curse on it. Let's go back on board at once. And if I might have the honor of naming this island, I should call it Deathwater. That strikes me as a very good name, Reep, said Caspian. Though now that I come to think of it, I don't know why. But the weather seems to be settling in, and I dare say Drinian would like to be off. What a lot we shall have to tell him. But in fact, they had not much to tell him, for the memory of the last hour had become confused. Their Majesty all seemed a bit bewitched when they came aboard, said Drinian to Rince some hours later, when the Dawn Treader was once more under sail, and Deathwater Island already below the horizon. Something happened to them in that place. The only thing I could get clear was that they'd found the body of one of the lords they were looking for. You don't say so, Captain, answered Rince. Well, that's 3. Only 4 more. Remember, one was the Lord Byrne at Narrow Haven, and one was Octavian, who had been turned into a dragon, and now the one who's been turned to gold. So that's 3 of the 7. At this rate, we might be home after the new year. And a good thing, too. My back is running a little bit low. Good night, sire. And that's the end of the chapter. Oh, you're going to love the next one. You just wait. I hope you guys have a good weekend and know that I love you.